has long said, hey, save people, right? And we're capable of doing that. So I want to get a little granular here and have you explain exactly what mindfulness-based stress reduction is beyond just, it's a pretty self-defining term, I suppose, but maybe talk about what mindfulness is and is not, and maybe demystify some of that and how it applies to all professions.
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a lot there.
It's a large one. Yes, feel free to start wherever you want.
Yeah, but I think it's a lot of what people are curious about. So one of the terms that sometimes we consider mindfulness as being a part of what's called the contemplative field. So there's lots of different kind of contemplative practices, and today, if you look at how mindfulness seems to be pervasive everywhere, which on the one hand is so amazing, it's like so cool that probably no one's sitting in an apartment like I was thinking like, is this a bunch of hippies? Like, yeah. I think there's this sense like, no, there's something really here that's valuable. But there's also kind of this mick mindfulness, this like watered down version of the way that it's maybe being promoted to people or explored. So when I think about mindfulness, there's two different things that come to mind. I mean, and this might be sort of a semantics issue, but there's this idea of being mindful, being attentive. People have that idea as far as like a word and a concept. And so that's true.
Being present, you mean like in the moment and not being distracted or mentally elsewhere?
I'm thinking just the word mindfulness itself, like I'm being mindful. Yeah, I'm being attentive to what I'm doing right here in the present moment. Right. So that's one thing. And then there's, meditation, which is a practice that you can do, an experiential practice that helps facilitate us having more mindfulness. So often when I define mindfulness, I think it's most closely related to awareness. Okay. So really having awareness of what's happening in the present moment while it's happening, which sounds simple, but definitely not easy as
it definitely takes practice for sure.
Yeah, it takes practice. But I think that's not all. So that's, I think that's generally how people understand mindfulness. But if you think of it that way, it's like, well, then your pet, like your dog, you might say that they're aware and they're in the present moment. That's also true. But are they being mindful? Is there another process happening behind that? And I think that's where the meditation aspect of we're actually developing a practice that cultivates more than just awareness. And I think it's difficult to say what that more is until you're actually practicing. So that's one thing that I'd like to say about mindfulness and about meditation in general, and particularly about mindfulness-based stress reduction. So when we look at mindfulness-based stress reduction, most of the secular research that has been done that shows neurological changes in the brain, they've used MBSR as a methodology for that work. So if you look at the scientific papers across the board, MBSR is pretty much the intervention that's getting used to get those results. And what I think is important about that is that MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, we have a 45-minute per day practice component. And so that means that the neurological changes that, a lot of different mindfulness, anybody that's doing mindfulness or promoting mindfulness is promoting all of these benefits, right? But the scientific benefits that we know of are only true in relationship to practice. And so I just think that's really important for people to sort of know and to be aware of. Because I think there is this concept of like, oh, well, I'll meditate when I get stressed out, and this is for stress reduction. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not about stress reduction. It's about awareness that can help you make choices which inform stress reduction. But it's really not about stress reduction. It's not about sleeping better. It's not about, all of those are side effects of the practice, but they're not what mindfulness is, if that makes sense. And I think there's a misperception there.
Yeah, it does make sense. And what I'm hearing there is a couple of different things going on, maybe three. One is an intentionality component. That's my favorite word in all of counseling, is knowing why you do what you do. So you have to know why you're using it. And the second part, which is related to the first, is you can't just learn it. You have to practice it. So as much as I love teaching emotional functioning, for example, and as often as I see heads pop when I teach this stuff, because it's not in any curriculum, it's like I'm teaching frontal lobe and limbic system and all that stuff. People are like, wow, that makes so much sense. How did I not know that? It itself, knowledge of it doesn't change anything. You have to rehearse it in order to apply it. And then the third thing is that it's not symptom treatment. It's problem resolution. Symptoms will resolve if you practice this well enough, because they simply don't surface as frequently because you're aware of them, and you can tamp them down as soon as you start feeling them come up. But then also when they come up, because that's how life works. Life is full of problems. When you're aware of when they come up, you're so ingrained in the practice that you can know how to redirect attention elsewhere and become present. And maybe, I'm guessing there's probably a non-attachment component here too, or you don't just like cling to things that stress you out. You learn to leave them where they be and deal with them in their due time, or let them go if you can't do anything about it. Am I getting close there?
Yeah, I think that is a lot of what happens. So with mindfulness, we have the opportunity to, because again, one of the misconceptions is like, oh, I'll move into this space where I just have no thoughts. And I think people almost think of it like zoning out somehow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really what happens is that it doesn't mean our thoughts go away, but that we're aware of where the thoughts go when they go away. And that's powerful. That's powerful because most of us don't know how often the mind is drifting off in the first place.
Yeah.
So one of the first things we do in any meditation practice, mindfulness or any other type, is that we're building concentration. So every time we notice the mind go off, we come back. Goes off again, comes back. So we're kind of training the mind to stay in the present. We actually know that gray matter in the area of concentration starts to increase when people practice meditation, which is cool.
You're building your brain?
Yeah,
wow,
you're actually,
that's cool.
Yeah, it's so cool. I know there's so much great research. And then the next thing that happens is, and again, because you know so much about the brain, you'll understand this, that when we start to become aware of where the mind is going when it drifts off, we might be starting to see, oh, here's like a habit or a pattern that I keep landing in. And so that's a neural pathway. That neural pathway has power, right?
Mm-hmm,
So as soon as we know that, we actually get to make a choice. We can choose like, no, I'm not going to let my attention go there. And we can actually start to build new neural pathways in the brain that are more helpful. And this is where the symptom reduction comes from, that rather than getting stuck in these old pathways that might be so familiar, we actually start to choose new ways of thinking that create new pathways and tend to help with all the symptom reduction. And I mean, one other thing that happens, you and I were talking about a little earlier, the amygdala, which helps kick in our fight, flight, freeze. We know that meditators start to have a calmer amygdala. It doesn't get activated as often. So it's very cool. And we know that now that has a direct impact on heart health. And so for many years, there was a lot of good research showing, like, we know that people can have improvements in cardiac health through meditation, but why? And the amygdala is that connection. It's like, well, your amygdala is not getting triggered as often. So it's really cool. All that we actually, I think about meditation a lot as almost like reverse engineering. I'm planning on writing a book about this, reverse engineering the human experience, because so much of what we do is what we were hardwired to do from a survival perspective. And it makes a lot of sense. When you're in danger, this body is amazing. We know how to respond. But in this modern life that we're living, and with the particular mind that we have that can predict into the future, unlike any other species, it can take us to places that aren't useful. So with mindfulness, we're really engaging the most evolved part of our brain and creating a lot more neural pathways with the other parts of the brain that are more reactive. and we're starting to be able to self-regulate much more effectively, and to notice the difference between a perceived threat versus an actual threat, so that our whole system doesn't get hijacked if it's only a perceived threat. Like, what is going to happen if I don't complete everything on my to-do list? That's a perceived threat. That's not maybe an actual threat. Well, depending on, then you look at the physicians right now who have an amazing caseload of patients they can't support. Well, then that's an actual threat. It's really impacting them. So, but just to say that there's a lot of times that we might be activating this whole system when it doesn't need to be activated. And mindfulness helps give us more and more information of the mind and the body. We don't leave out the body. There's so many signals. The body experiences everything first. So it's really this, kind of utilizing everything that we have, and then engaging the prefrontal cortex, that self-regulatory part of the brain, to help control all of that.
There's so much in there I want to explore. It's all very, very brilliant. I'll just wait to read the book, and all the listening audience can do that too. No, just kidding. So some reflections. One is the idea that the amygdala, which triggers your fight, flight, some call it fight, flight, or freeze response, then begets a limbic response, which is your emotions. Emotions are comprised of brain chemicals like cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine and epinephrine and so forth. And some of those are useful in a situation like, saber-toothed tiger wants to eat my face. And that triggers the entire body response as well as the brain response to act. And what I'm hearing is, with regard to cardiac health, you're not overloading your system to the point that you're constantly raising your heart rate over what could be artificial threats. And I don't want to say artificial, but perceived, because it could be a real threat. If you don't get quote unquote everything done, there could be some harm that befalls you. Maybe you get a demotion or job loss, or you don't clean the house and your wife yells at you. Hypothetically speaking, of course. But if we can attenuate that somehow by being aware, being self-aware, using the mindfulness practices to evaluate real from perceived, but also a timeliness with regard to how much time do I have to deal with this threat, real or perceived, whether it's a saber-toothed tiger 6 feet away who wants to chew my face off from, when we were cavemen and cave ladies, versus cleaning the house, which, all right, I checked my watch, I got an hour and a half. It seems overwhelming, but really I just take one step at a time and I get everything put in order before spouse comes home. We can calm down some of the physiological responses and then keep ourselves body healthy, if I can invent a phrase. But I'm also hearing that this is applicable to multiple interfaces, I guess, or interactions. So I'm thinking of I don't know why, just other than he's just a really good guy and he's really smart and I love what he does. But Austin Byler, a friend of mine who's been on the podcast a couple of times, he teaches baseball to youth, and he does a lot of emotion-based interventions and strategies. And I'm thinking, like, if you got a neural pathway, and what you're referring to there is a concept called neuroplasticity, where we can, the brain is malleable. It can change. We don't have to just be imprisoned to our old patterns and habits. If I fall into a slump, can I use mindfulness-based stress reduction to get myself out of the slump and say, oh, I don't want to swing like that anymore, and I actually want to hit curveballs or something like that? Is it applicable to athletics, and have you done any work in that area?
So it is applicable to athletics, and so you're going to notice my very poor awareness of
oh dear, here we go.
But
home runs are in baseball, not football.
No, in Seattle, their football team actually had a mindfulness coach, and they won the Super Bowl that year. And so actually, at that point, Microsoft got really interested in like, oh, there's something to that. And so we'd love to see how that actually applies to the business world as well. And for sports, one of the things that's really cool about it is oftentimes, like say you're out and so I am athletic. I just don't pay attention to like, I did martial arts for many years, so I can apply it to myself in like being in a tournament or something. And if I start to get in my head and start to psych myself out, or especially once I do something wrong, then all of a sudden I'm missing everything else that like I get totally derailed from the moment. And you can imagine how that would happen in like a baseball game or a football game, right? Like you don't hit the ball and now you're in your head, like, what if I don't hit the next one, or you miss a pass or whatever. And so with mindfulness, what happens is it allows you not to let your mind follow that thought. You actually just notice, oh, that was just a thought. And then you're right back in the moment. And so it really